A couple of months ago, as your newly arrived intern minister, I sat here on this platform with all the conspicuousness of a new kid on the block. I had written a little about myself in the August Messenger, so some of you had read about how I found my way to the Unitarian Universalist Church in 1987, how I found welcome here as a gay man, that my first career was in HIV prevention, that I worked as a hospital chaplain, and now here. As I sat looking out at you, some of you were looking back at me, and I'm guessing we wondered about each other. Who are you? Will I like you? What makes you tick? All those private, unspoken questions that are part of being curious people. Christine recapped some of my biography in her generous introduction, and then she added, "And he is a UU Christian." My heartbeat sped up. I scanned the room for reactions. OMG, I thought to myself. I've just been outed. Or that's how it felt. The feeling led me pretty quickly to reflect upon my self-consciousness of claiming a Christian identity as a Unitarian Universalist. Here, being Christian feels a little countercultural. You were a pretty poker-faced crowd. Afterwards, as many of you greeted and welcomed me, a few people commented. One couple acknowledged that they too were Christian and explained how they often divide Sunday attendance between here and another church. At least one person volunteered that she didn't have much tolerance for Christianity, but if I needed it, that was my business. Another asked with astonishment, why would someone be a UU Christian? A hallmark of the free church is one's liberty to speak one's mind, and I honor the frank honesty in these expressions. But the comment that really hooked me was one person's curiosity if I found it easier to come out as a gay man in a UU church than as a Christian. I thought for a moment, and then replied, yes, I think it is. My internal reaction to Christine's introduction confirmed this for me. Our denomination has been welcoming gays and lesbians for decades. We're leaders of the pack in proclaiming a radical hospitality. That's what I responded to when I walked through the doors of First Unitarian in Dallas in 1987. My being gay was affirmed as just part of the diversity. But coming out Christian in a UU church, this man wondered, might be a little more complicated. I think he was spot on. My sense is that broadly speaking, and there's always danger in that, broadly speaking, Unitarian Universalists in the 21st century have an uneasy relationship with the expression of Christian worship in our churches. I've often heard people begin to answer the question, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? With the negative saying what we are not, and sometimes beginning with, well, we're not Christian. But that's not accurate. I mean, here people are free to follow or not any number of traditions. We pitch a very broad tent as evidenced by the mural behind me. From time to time, elements of any of the world's religious traditions show up in Sunday worship. I mean, these tea lights in observation of Diwali, for example. But I can't recall ever hearing concerns in UU churches about worship being too Buddhist or too Jewish or too Hindu. As a group, we tend not to have the self-conscious reflex about expressions of other traditions that we sometimes have with Christianity. And I've been wondering why. This morning, I want to unpack some of this uneasy relationship. It has historical roots, and take a shot at answering the question, who is a Unitarian Universalist Christian? I'll share a little of my coming out story, as it were. My hope is that in sharing some of my journey being Christian and Unitarian Universalist will make sense to those who are a little skeptical, and that Christians will find in this church a warm welcome for furthering their religious journey. I also hope that for those among us who have been disappointed or even harmed by the Christian church, something in this message this morning might refresh Christianity as part of a tradition you own. Fear not, there'll be no altar call or summons to religious conversion. I trust your experience and the universal truth that revelation is ongoing for us all. I think a good starting place may be to take a look at our Unitarian Universalist history and our Christian roots, because therein lies some of the why for me. Now, this gets a little dense, so bear with me. When a minority group defines itself, it often does so against a majority that holds power and privilege. That was the case for Unitarians and Universalists in the 19th century. When each tradition arose in New England 2 centuries ago, it did so in opposition to an Orthodox Christianity, or what prevailed as the official church party line. This opposition wasn't new. Unitarians emerged in Europe centuries earlier as a heretical spin on Catholicism and Calvin's Reformation. But in early 19th century New England, Unitarians asserted themselves against the covenants of the Puritan church that stood on every town square, the church to which everyone was required to pay taxes. Really, it used to be that way. Unitarians rejected the idea that Jesus was God and the Trinitarian framework of God as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, God as 3 in 1. Again, old arguments dating back to the first centuries of Christianity. Unitarians were suspicious of ritual expressions of piety that did not, they believed, deliver one closer to God. So no sacramental confession, no communion, no infant baptism. Universalists had a different emphasis. They distinguished themselves by rejecting ideas of predestination and insisted that no one is beyond God's all-encompassing love, that all are saved, no exceptions. If you were here last week for our All Souls Day service, you remember that we talked about this. In the 19th century, Unitarians and Universalists, among others, were asserting a liberal Christianity. James Luther Adams, one of the most prominent and influential Unitarian ministers and American theologians of the last century, notes how liberal Christianity rejected the notion that the cosmos is a hierarchy and that society must be organized on the pattern of hierarchy controlled by priest and monarch. Now remember, just a century earlier, the United States declared its political independence from an allegiance to a king, and people were now expanding this independence in our churches. Unitarians and Universalists embraced a democratic approach to church governance. The congregation holds the power, and your ministers are no closer to God than you. In the mid-20th century, humanism had emerged on the scene, which uplifted the place of human experience and reason. As the newer ideology in the pulpit, it too was defining itself in contrast to 20th century church norms, which until the 1950s would have still looked pretty Protestant in most of our churches. At that same time, both Unitarian and Universalist denominations were struggling to remain solvent. In 1961, they merged to become the Unitarian Universalist Association. Transitions are hard. Not everyone was pleased with the merger. The Unitarians were too humanist for some Universalists, and Universalists were too Christian for some Unitarians, but by and large, the fit was better than not, and we've been working it out ever since. So it's a fair summation to say that the Unitarian Universalist Church emerged under the pressure to define itself against traditional Protestantism. Now, an important aside, our denomination includes some expressly Christian Unitarian Universalist churches. Did you know that? I didn't until recently. Some of you may have visited King's Chapel, a historic UU church on the Boston Freedom Trail. Founded in 1686, it is the oldest American pulpit still in use. At King's Chapel, you will hear a liturgy that sounds familiar to Catholics, Episcopalians, and Lutherans. Other UU churches worship similarly. I highlight this just to remind us that Christianity is not an artifact in our denominational history. About 25 congregations in the United States are members of the Council of Christian Churches of the Unitarian Universalist Association. With the exception of a small fellowship in Turley, Oklahoma, all are east of the Mississippi. Not a surprise, really. In the early 20th century, the most fervent growth in humanism occurred in the midsection of the country. Again, many Unitarian and at that time they were Unitarian, not yet Unitarian Universalist, many Unitarian churches distanced themselves from anything that looked too Protestant. So with this thumbnail sketch of our history, you get a sense of how we've evolved to be a little self-conscious of looking too Christian. In asserting our difference, though, sometimes we overcompensate. When you're the minority, you've often got to work hard to claim your place. Given that many people find their way to the UU Church from Christian traditions that stopped making sense, some of us may feel compelled to define ourselves against that old way of being religious, rather than for the pluralistic expression that's central to our tradition. It's a hard habit to shake. It's my hope that our worship reflects what we're for, not against. Unitarian or Universalist Christianity is not the Christianity that many of us know from the churches we left. Like some of you, perhaps, oneness of God and universal worthiness are not what I remember from the Catholicism I knew as a kid. My earliest imagination of God was of a supernatural being who was in control and ordered all things. God was the Heavenly Father, almighty and all-powerful, and frankly, a little scary. The Jesus I knew as a kid was a fair-skinned, flaxen-haired miracle worker with a halo. Plus, we had the saints to whom we could appeal. When I was about 9 years old, my devoutly Catholic grandmother gave me a laminated prayer card. One side of the card featured an artistic rendering of St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost causes. The other had the text of the petitionary prayer. In the middle of the text is a prompt for one to name his request. One evening I was playing with a small plastic toy, some kind of flying object propelled by a rubber band wound tight. This toy was a free surprise that came inside a box of Cracker Jacks. Let's face it, as a snack food, Cracker Jacks needs all the allure it can attract. And that free surprise was mightily compelling to this 9-year-old. In my playing with this, the rubber band flew off and became lost in my room. I searched and couldn't find it. I despaired. My free surprise was disabled. Then I remembered my laminated St. Anthony prayer card and thought, I wonder. I took it in my hand, dropped to my knees at my bedside, bowed my head, and prayed like the dickens. As I prayed, I acknowledged that it probably wasn't the most important concern God had on his plate, but could he please help me find this lost rubber band? Oh, I would be good and faithful. Soon after rising from this prayer, there was the rubber band. Prayer answered. All the proof I needed that this God stuff was real. Things looked simpler through the eyes of childhood. But as a teenager, it became apparent that God wasn't alleviating the angst of my same-sex attraction and making me straight. Despite my beseeching, I began not to trust this God who was allegedly in control, who would allow me to be gay when I didn't want to be, the God who didn't intervene to ease my suffering. I wandered unchurched and disconnected from any spiritual anchor until my former partner and I moved to Dallas in 1987. We found the church in a way many people do. As newcomers to Dallas, we searched for a community where we would be welcome and make friends, the same search that brought many of you here. I brought with me some of my childhood imagination of who God is. No matter how strange they look to our adult eyes, those early impressions of God and Jesus are indelibly imprinted and can be hard to shake, even when we don't really believe them. And years later, they can still provoke sharp resistance. Consequently, some of us have retired God and Jesus altogether. The UU Church helped me understand that religions are highly creative responses to the vast mystery in which we live our lives. They provide a window through which we see and understand God. Now, if God isn't your word and I'm starting to lose you, substitute or translate as you need. Call it the source or the one, but stay with me. Religion isn't the truth. It's the frame through which we seek to understand truth. It's a perspective, a way of seeing and naming God. and it's possible to look through different windows and see different things, different aspects of God. It's like the Zen metaphor of a finger pointing at the moon. If you concentrate on the finger, you'll miss the moon. This is the point our Unitarian ancestors were making in rejecting public displays of piety. While I see how that made sense in the 19th century, we have a more worldly acquaintance with religious rituals, as the mural reminds us. There are many ways of focusing our attention on the mystery, and we're free to do what makes sense to us. When I came to the UU Church 25 years ago, this kind of thinking was new to me. But it wasn't until I started a devotional practices workshop in a UU church in 2004 when my reimagination of God and understanding of Jesus germinated. Here's where the story starts to turn for me. I was in the midst of a proverbial dark night of the soul. My relationship had ended and I felt lost. I no longer had St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost causes, to turn to. I yearned to experience a connection with the divine, the mystery, to which I felt some vague connection in church on Sunday mornings, but I didn't have a practice or a discipline with which to engage that connection daily, and I needed daily sustenance. That's when I enrolled in the devotional practices workshop, Living by Heart, that the church was offering. Devotional practice was something I felt very far away from. In this workshop, participants commit to a daily discipline of reading and memorizing poetry and practicing various kinds of meditation. One of the UU ministers who authored the workshop, the late Harry Schofield, is featured in the DVD that's one of the teaching resources. Harry recounts how psalmists he memorized early in his life sometimes came to him, like a visitor offering comfort and guidance. He recited the excerpt of Psalm 139 you heard a few moments ago. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Upon first hearing Harry recite these words, they inhabited me. They spoke to me of an enduring connection to the divine from which nothing can ever separate me. No dark night of the soul, no corrupt behavior, no death. The words of the ancient psalmists spoke to me, and I wondered how it would be to live with the psalmist's faith, a question I ponder still daily. In the psalm, I recognized the oneness and universality of God that I had been introduced to in the UU church, a way of understanding God that our universalist ancestors professed. I think I understood for the first time how scriptures are meant to be used, not as an instruction manual for what to eat or drink or to prove our piety, not as historical record of exactly what happened and when. Instead, they're meant to inhabit us, work changes within us, orient our days. They are meant to enliven our imagination of and connection to God. Over time, I developed a daily practice of reading Christian and Hebrew scriptures. I stepped back into participating in seasons of the Christian liturgical year, an ancient cycle that is a way of practicing religion. Now, most of the time, I'm not stuck in my imagination of the westernized Jesus I described from my childhood. It's unlikely he was fair-skinned and flaxen-haired. Humans tend to recreate God and Jesus in familiar forms and in authority figures like king or father. I think Jesus would be appalled by how he has been deified and idolized in many Christian churches. This is what I found so refreshing about the stained glass windows of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas, when I visited. On one side of the sanctuary, the windows are traditional depictions of Jesus and biblical scenes. On the other, the windows depict modern images of Jesus as a distinctly Middle Eastern-looking, dark-skinned man, someone who might well be selected for extra scrutiny going through airport security. These windows refresh my imagination of Jesus. I understand Jesus as a prophet and teacher who, through the Gospels and letters, has much to say about how to orient one's life to God. His was a ministry of justice and transformation in ways I yearn to be transformed and for our world to be transformed. I think of him carrying the spark of divinity that lies within us all. Nothing supernatural about it. Just the truth that human beings can manifest when we peel back layers of ego and fear that muck up our relations with one another and with all our creation. This is a way of understanding Jesus through a Unitarian Universalist lens. This is what I mean by a Unitarian Universalist Christianity. In a few weeks, when we light the first Advent candle on the Advent wreath, this church will acknowledge the beginning of Advent, a Christian season of expectation and waiting for the coming of Christ. What does that mean for us? When I was in my dark night of the soul that I referenced a moment ago, I was heartbroken, angry, and scared. The future I imagined had dissolved, and I felt lost. Have you been there? One evening, I was shopping in a department store buying some clothing, seeking the anesthetizing comfort of a good sale, what we do when we're grief-stricken. As I approached the counter to pay for my shirts, the sales clerk greeted me. She was an older, efficient woman who looked to be well into retirement age, and I wondered about her life. I wondered if she had to work this retail job to make ends meet. I wondered if this was a second job, one that she came to after a day of work elsewhere. Did she live alone? What burdens did she carry? What dark nights of the soul had she known? All of this percolated within me when she took my shirts, and as she started to ring up my purchase, she inquired in a routinely friendly voice, "How are you?" I hesitated. Her inquiry caught me off guard. I didn't have the resources to make small talk, not even the mask of a dismissive fine. I wanted to cry out. Instead, I responded with a low and tremulous voice, "I'm having a really hard time." She stopped what she was doing, looked me in the eye, and with thorough attentiveness said, "It's bad, huh?" "Yeah," I said. She heard me. I don't remember anything about our exchange beyond that, but I remember that piece vividly. She held my sorrow and sadness, if only for a moment, and broke through my aloneness. She comforted me. I didn't have language then to put it this way, but the religious awakening within me since helps me name it. Christ came to me in that moment when the sales clerk met my eye and held my sadness. Advent reminds me that Christ is coming among us again. Christ is always coming among us and through us if we will meet her gaze. We have a sign at the corner of Carlisle and Comanche that we update each week to promote to the general public the forthcoming sermon title and speaker. The first of last week, Angela pointed out that it reads, "Who is a Unitarian Universalist Christian? Bryan Ellwood." Talk about being outed. And of course, I'm not the only Christian in this church. Most of you don't think of yourselves as Christian. Many of you may not believe in God. What matters most, I think, is that we seek truth and understanding. That's our covenant. This church needs seekers to live their questions and practice their truth in all of the multifaceted ways we understand it. The world needs religious practitioners of many traditions because each helps us see from refreshed perspectives. Just as these lights of Diwali are meant to dispel ignorance and open us to compassion and awareness of the oneness of all things, so is our seeking together. Amen. So if you'll join me now in our closing hymn, number 126, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing."